So let's talk about knees in. I know I'm a little bit late to the party, but after what David and Dan Back from Jump Science have talked about, I think I have something to contribute. Here though, visually the knees looks like they're in, it actually may be a result of hip internal rotation. And because it's impossible to search for things on Instagram, essentially what Dan said is that the knees in is only that way from a certain perspective. So here I have a 3D digitization of the human model with the centers of the hip defining the start of the thigh, and then the markers beside on the knees that define the center of the knee. So this line essentially is a line from the hip to the knee, or you can somewhat think of it as an approximation of the femur. And similarly for the shank bone. So think from a 3D perspective, if we take a specific angle from the side here, you can say, oh my god, the knees is inside of the foot. And if we zoom this way, we can see that, oh my god, that the knees is inside of the foot. So this must be disaster, right? But one of the main things that Dan brought up is that it's only that way from a certain perspective. So you see, if we actually go in line with the foot, we see everything's actually nicely lined up here for the right leg. And similarly for the left leg, right? The thigh, the shank, and the foot in line. And what's also nice is that in this visualization, you can see how the force pretty much travels straight through the leg in this instant in time. So this sort of illustrates the limitations of only looking at a movement in a single frame from a single angle. So here's an article that looks at the relationship between knee kinematics and the ACL strain during a single leg jump. So I don't actually have access to the full paper, but let's just read through the abstract and see what's going on. One of the really cool things in this study is that they used a high-speed biplane radiography, and that's basically a way for you to visualize the actual skeleton of the body and the other tissues while in movements. And that's how they're actually going to model the strain on the ACL in the actual movements of interest. So with the ACL strain, they also calculated the knee flexion extension angles and the various valgus angles in the sagittal and frontal plane, respectively, before running a correlation. So at first glance, the result is actually a little strange, right? Because it says the ACL strain is maximized when the knee is straight, or in a way when the knees are aligned, and in your head, you would think that's the safest position. But this can be explained by the higher force when you're contacting the ground with your limbs relatively straight. So the further you bend, the more of your momentum is already being slowed down, so the force will actually be less, right? What's also interesting is because I think this is a healthier cohort, there's a very few degrees of varus and valgus position, which makes the correlation analysis quite hard to run. So in a way, this actually couldn't really tell you about the injury mechanism where you see a much higher valgus angle. Additionally, having the context of the forces will let you know, hey, is the strain the largest just because the force is higher, or is it more due to the knee being in a straighter position? So spooky about the ACL strain research that that people calculate from the models, like the post I just made, is all of them say the maximum ACL strain, or how much it deforms relative to its original length, it's all maximum while the person's in the air and the legs is straight. But when's the last time you see a person that tear the ACL in the air with their knee straight, right? It doesn't make sense. Things just doesn't connect, and I don't know why. One paper that directly investigates the effect of a valgus or valgus collapse position with 30 degrees of knee flexion, hip IR, and tibial ER, which is what people describe as that torsion position of the knee, and the ACL length actually decreased, so it's actually shorter. There's less of a strain. So what is going on here? To try to explain what's going on, maybe it's just that the collapse happened after the ACL has failed, right? And a lot of papers are talking about landing, or when you're changing direction, planting the foot on the ground with unanticipated timing on an extended knee might be when the ACL actually fails, as opposed to the knees coming in, which may be an after effect, because none of them talked about valgus. So is it about bending your limbs upon contact with the ground the key to preventing ACL injuries all along? Maybe. So in my past few videos, I've actually casted doubt on the link between knees in and then ACL injuries. My rationale was never that knees in was never bad, but rather ACL injury seems to have happened in a different position way earlier during ground contact, as opposed to the crazy knees positions that you see later on, which is more exaggerated. And in the previous studies I've shared where they used the X-ray machines to film the positions of the skeleton and then model the length and or strain of the UCL. But there are some other ways to investigate, the connection between knee motion in different planes and future injury risks, for example, like this study. And this article with a very beefy title essentially investigates if there's any relationship between knee motion you see in screening tasks and future non-contact injuries. Some of the screening tasks here that they investigated are the single leg squat and the drop jump test, where you do see quite a lot of knees coming in. This study actually includes more than 800 elite female athletes over a 7-year period, with many test sessions as well as 56 non-contact injuries that's been tracked. And they found none of the variables were able to predict risks of future injuries. Therefore, the conclusion of the study was that two-dimensional video assessments, where you look at the knees coming in, cannot identify future risks and therefore should not be used for screening. And that is not to say that knees in are not good or bad, it's just it's not useful for future ACL injuries.